Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Friday, October 17th, 2025, and on Fridays we talk about human behavior and justifications. But because it's October 17th, a special shout out to a very special someone in my life who shall remain nameless because she doesn't like to be mentioned in the vlog. It's her birthday today, so happy birthday to that special someone. All right, and now I have to shift gears entirely because we've been talking about homicide and the lethal nature potentially of different species within their own species. That is, the likelihood of killing one's conspecifics or members of the same species. And we were noting that, at least amongst humans, there seems to be a much higher rate or propensity to kill one another than in other species as such. But primates in general tend to be a fairly violent array or family of different species with higher rates of homicide and infanticide and all these sorts of things. So, but at the same time, I concluded yesterday's vlog by talking about, by suggesting or hinting at that there's some good news, at least with respect to human beings. So, believe it or not, we've actually become less lethal towards one another over the last 100 to 200,000 years, again, of history and human prehistory. And so while we're obviously still killing one another in wars and genocides, and especially in the 20th century, we saw considerably millions of people die with respect to wars and genocides, to say nothing of our current homicide rates across different countries. The point is that the rates at which we die at the hands of each other, rather than, or as a fraction or as a proportion of all possible causes, has continued to decline, and especially in the 21st century too. So here's a very simple statistic to help drive home that point. So in 2023, at least in Canada specifically now, there were 796 official homicides that year. And that same year, there were an estimated 326,571 deaths in total. So what percentage of people died from homicide? Simple math, just the percentage. And the data indicate that just under 1/4 of 1% of people died from conspecifics or interpersonal violence in Canada in 2023. And I looked back 50 years ago, or almost 50 years ago, 1975, there were 701 deaths due to homicides and 285,615 deaths overall. And once again, that indicates just under 1/4 of 1 percentage point died from conspecifics. So in effect, the rates haven't changed at all over the last half century. And they're kind of, reasonably low. But, of course, lethal violence varies across countries and sometimes quite dramatically. So if you look at the US, the rates from homicide alone are about 3 times higher than in Canada, if you actually just compare the homicide rates directly. But then if you dig deeper and you see, okay, well, what about as a percentage of all deaths? Well, the same result. So in other words, what you find in the United States in 2023 is that there were 22,830 homicides and just over 3 million total deaths from all causes. And that means that, again, do the math, just under 3/4 of 1 percentage point of all people died in the US from conspecifics or interpersonal violence in 2023. But don't feel bad if you live in the US, because you can look to your southern border and just beyond. Look at Mexico. In 2023, there were over 31,000 homicides in Mexico alone, and only about 928,000 total deaths from all causes. So that means that a whopping 3.3% of all deaths in Mexico in 2023 were due to interpersonal violence. So that's about 14 times higher than in Canada and over 4.5 times higher than in the US. So, and remember too, we're only talking about homicides in these countries because there haven't been the ongoing wars and genocides, of other places on their soils. And so if you add these types of conflicts into the equation, then the rates of killing of conspecifics can rise quite dramatically. So for example, in the final year of World War II in 1945, an estimated 110,000 US soldiers died in the conflict, and yet about 1.4 million people died on US soil overall, not including the soldiers. So the point is that the deaths just from the battle alone, as a fraction of all, or as a percentage of all deaths in the US, stood at about 7.5%. So again, much higher. And so you can imagine then what the death rates of conspecifics would be from other humans if you were to look at a place like Ukraine over the last couple of years, or even worse, if you were to look at the deaths in Gaza. Now, conversely, and again, this is, if you will, good news. There are other places, other countries where the homicide rates, for example, are much lower, such as Japan and even Australia. So in fact, in 2023, in Australia, only about 1/10 of 1% of their deaths were due to interpersonal violence. And so that's less than even half the rate of Canada. And in Japan, there were only 289 homicides in 2023 and over 1.5 million deaths in total, for a rate of just under 2/100ths of 1%. So extremely low. So what are the conclusions that we can draw then about humans? Well, we have far more flexibility or variability in our proclivities to kill one another. Yes, we are still quite a lethal species, but at the same time, it's obviously not hardwired into our genetics, because look at how widely the homicide rates and the death rates vary just across different countries. We're all the same species, right? And yet our homicide rates vary dramatically. If you look at our different groups, our different tribes, and our different territories. And of course, that's mostly due to cultural differences. And then if you factor in much more than that, not just the homicides, but the deaths due to wars, the genocides, all the other sources of human conflict. Again, we see tremendous variability across the species. So if it were genetic, we'd expect to see relatively comparable rates across the species, regardless of location. But that's not what we see. There are instead vastly different rates amongst human beings. Heck, even sometimes within the same country, right? So there have been several years in Prince Edward Island, for example, here in Canada, our smallest province, where they've actually had 0 homicides, and several where they've had 1 or 2 homicides total. So is there a different species of Canadians living in PEI then? Some might suggest yes, but of course the answer is no. Same species, but different location, different region, different social demographics, different lifestyles, different cultures. And so while every species can exhibit aggression, and certainly all primates can be violent at times, humans exhibit a much larger range across their species as a species in terms of the likelihood of using one or more different types of lethal violence against conspecifics. Okay, well, to me, that's just one of the most fascinating aspects of the human condition, and much more to be said about these issues as well. So in the meantime, though, for now, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture your love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance, and may you find peace every day of your life. Take care.